Welcome to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast with Alex Dean and Bryan Cunningham. Here we have a drink, have a laugh, and you just might learn something about our favorite stories from history.
Please visit our website at hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you like the show, please rate us 5 stars and leave a review. Cheers.
Welcome to lucky episode 13, everyone. It seems like only yesterday we launched this adventure, and now, thanks to you listeners, by one count, we are in the top 5 of all podcasts worldwide. Alex, what do you think of that, buddy?
I've got to tell you, it's 5%, not 5. But other than that, you know, your maths always being your central key strength, Bryan. Boy, I wish we were the top 5 podcasts in the world. But we're in the top 5%, and I'm very proud of it.
I personally feel thrice blessed. First, our ranking of our podcast. Thanks again, listeners. Secondly, Alex and I back together through the magic of Jeremy's production. You might have thought we were in the studio together on our last episode, but in fact, we weren't. Alex was on top secret assignment, everyone. Now we're back. Alex, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Good to be back, Bryan.
And finally, I couldn't be more excited, Alex, to welcome our very special guest today, Myke Cole. Myke with a Y, Cole. First things first, though, based on Myke's guidance that ancient Greek warriors likely drank, if anything, watered wine. While I'm not committed enough to the podcast to add water to a wonderful bottle of wine, I am enjoying an amazing bottle of Pinot Noir from one of my favorite vineyards, Willamette Valley Vineyards. And FYI, listeners, I don't ordinarily like Pinot, but this is a great bottle. And if you are in the lovely hills near Salem, Oregon anytime soon, please go. Full disclosure, I like this wine so much, I'm a small owner of the company.
Well, I don't have anything like that to plug, but I've gone one further than you in the commitment stakes, as usual. And I am drinking a dry white wine from Crete. Katrina and I were in Crete in the summer and drank a lot of wine, as is your constitutional duty when you're on the island. And I'm going to mangle this pronunciation, but any Greek person can correct me. Pyrovalikes is the white wine that I'm drinking. Reasonable retail price, very rounded in taste, a little bit of minerality to it as well. And we liked it a lot when we were on holiday. So with this episode, with our Greek theme, it seemed the very best thing to drink.
Very well played, my friend. And would you say that the notes on the nose are insouciant, but not too far from innocence?
Much like myself. Exactly, it must be right. Pyrovalikes, I suppose. That's how a Greek person would pronounce it.
Well, we're going to ask our expert in a minute. Now, look, everybody, I knew that Myke Cole had had a full first career in several 3-letter agencies for the U.S. government as a Coast Guard commander and in the NYPD. And I met Myke when we were both involved in the CBS reality show Hunted about 5 years ago. Episode still available on Amazon. Myke was the talent, and I was 100% behind the camera, which is really just good news for everyone. What I didn't know about my friend Myke Cole was that Myke also is the author of 10, count them, 10 published novels, 9 of which I admit are unread by me, but the one I've read is amazing. Well done. And has published 2 books now about ancient Greek warfare, including The Bronze Lies, Shattering the Myth of Spartan Warrior Supremacy, which makes Myke maybe the perfect possible expert to talk about Alex's story today, especially because Myke's book devotes 7 full single-space pages to the Battle of Platea, which we're going to talk about. Welcome, Myke.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I want to make one comment on alcohol. You said a lot of lovely things about Greek wine. My one experience with Greek wine is with Retsina.
Right, less
right.
wholly positive.
Yeah, right. The best comparison I can make is it's like drinking a tree. That's the best way I could say it. But I will say this: after you have like 2 or 3 glasses, it tastes pretty good.
Well, Myke, based on my experience with Retsina, I'm going to paraphrase someone about the 1960s. If you remember drinking Retsina, you probably didn't.
Yeah, okay.
That's outstanding.
Let's get right to Alex's story. But Myke, do you want to set the historical stage for the Plateans?
So the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, if we're going to set the stage for this, we have to go back to some geopolitical machinations that occurred just prior to the battle. King Cleomenes I of Sparta had foreign policy ambitions in the Attic Peninsula where Athens was. And this actually resulted in a Spartan army marching on Athens and half of that army melting away, resulting in a new law that both the Spartan kings, Sparta had a weird, sort of unusual dual kingship, which I think a lot of people don't know about, but both of the kings could no longer take the field at the same time. That law resulted in this humiliating defeat of literally half the army turning around and saying, yeah, we're not interested in this fight. But that threat to Athens forced Athens to reach out to the nearest regional power who they felt could protect them from Sparta. And who was the biggest dog on the block this is prior to 490 BC, but in the prior to 490 BC, who was the biggest dog on the block was Achaemenid Persia, right? This is the Persia of Darius, the same Persia of Xerxes who had come to Thermopylae in 480 BC. And they reached out to Persia for assistance, for alliance, and they gave tokens, earth and water, which, as we've all seen in the film 300, is this token of submission. Now, one of the things that I think people don't understand is that to Darius, that's an emotional commitment. That's a familial thing, right? There's a lot of othering done of the Persians when we talk about the Greco-Persian Wars, where we sort of, dismiss them as Machiavellian. There's a lot of, and frankly, a lot of it is kind of bigoted, right? It's an East versus West narrative. But the truth is that from what we understand of Achaemenid Persian culture, Darius took his responsibilities to his subjects very seriously, right? When he took earth and water from the Athenians, they became his people. And he became, I think, to look at it from an Achaemenid perspective, almost a father to them, right?
But wait, Mike. So let me ask you a question about that.
Sure.
So when you speak of this familial relationship, is that similar to what Vladimir Putin feels about Volodymyr Zelensky?
I mean,
little brother.
So all right. So you make a good point, right? It is partly Machiavellian. It is partly geopolitical. It is partly self-interested, but it is also different, right? The Persians are not the Russians. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that, this was an emotional thing for Darius. This is an emotional thing for the Persians. So when the existential threat of Sparta evaporated and Athens realized that they were okay, and then they pitched in during the Ionian Revolt. So the Ionians, of course, are Greeks who lived on the west coast of Turkey, subjects of the Achaemenid Persians, who felt a kinship to the Greeks, right? They are Greeks, but they have a common language, they have common religion, common customs, even though, the Ionians live across the sea on the coast of Turkey. Well, when the Ionian Revolt happens, the Athenians pitch in and they burn Sardis, one of the major satrapies, the sort of capital cities of one of the Persian subject satrapies, to the ground. So this is not just a normal attack on Persian hegemony, right? This is a betrayal. So they went to Xerxes with earth and water. They submitted. They became part of what Darius probably thought of as a family, right? And now they're burning down his capital of one of his satrapies. So that was a real emotional betrayal to him. And so, of course,
kind of reminds me of the War of 1812 when the British tried to burn down Washington, D.C.
I got a good chunk of it.
Yeah, fair enough.
They did a fairly good job, right? So, but so you can see that, they're not having that, right? There has to be a reprisal, right? There is this now terrorist state to the west. And there's a couple of things here. Some of it's emotional, but some of it is also Darius simply thinking like, hey, man, if I let this stand, if I let people who give earth and water and submit to my suzerainty burn down the capital of one of my provinces, everyone's going to do it. And he's certainly right about that.
This reminds me, Mike, of Alex's favorite line from the Al Capone movie.
Go ahead. I'd love to hear it, Alex.
Which one are you talking about? Who would pretend to be
Sean
that?
Connery.
Not?
No. Sean Connery. Bring in a knife. Bring in a bat.
Bring a knife to a gunfight. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, so and of course Darius does it, right? There's an initial mission that's unsuccessful, but he comes with what we know to be a vast army. Now, I don't want to overstate this, right? Popular historians love to skew the story of the Battle of Marathon,
especially contemporary popular historians.
Correct. Yes, correct. And we know that there was roughly 10,000, at least heavy infantry present on the Greek side, right? Of which a very small proportion of them were the Plateans. And against them, the Persians are supposed to be like some insane number. And the only honest answer is we don't know the exact number. We know it was lopsided. And that gets us to the battlefield. But let me shut up now, because I know you wanted me to just sort of give the background, and I want to give.
No, you should. I want you before every story now, Mike, because you've got a new gig. You make me look a lot smarter. You give this erudite explanation of the story that I've cherry picked from history. I thought you did that really well. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks,
the
Mike.
story of Platea is a happy one, and then it's a sad one. Separately to what Mike was just setting out, in the 520s BC, this little city-state called Platea asked the Spartans for an alliance because they were afraid of the Thebans. And mischievously, Sparta told them to ally with Athens, which was an enemy of Thebes. And Sparta was very angry when that alliance was actually agreed. Careful what you joke about, Spartans. Mm-hmm. And so then fast forward to the point that Mike was making. Athens is now at daggers drawn with Darius and the Persian army. Darius and his army march westwards, determined to burn Athens to the ground. That's the oath that Darius has sworn. But, it's plainly bad news for all Greeks, not just the Athenians. And led by Miltiades, the great general, the Athenians march to face the Persians, and they know they're going to meet them at Marathon in 490 BC. And in order to do that, they'd sent for help. They sent for help to other Greek towns, but no help came. Not even from Marshall, or not Marshall, as we might find out from Mike, Sparta. The Spartans said they were busy observing a festival, couldn't possibly march.
Training, whatever.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Far too late. So great. Thanks, Sparta. Camped alone and frightened on the plain the night before the battle. The Athenian sentinels spy these dust clouds in the distance. And of course, they fear it's a second Persian army. They fear it's the Persians have been reinforced by someone else, by another set of Persians. But it was the Plateans. In Athens' hour of need, the plucky Plateans from their tiny city-state had come panstratia, one of my favorite words in Greek, which means drop everything, send everyone. All 1,000 of them had come. And their contribution to the might of Athens might have been small, as Mike was setting out. But for Athens to no longer stand alone against the enemy, I think meant a great deal. And the Athenians and the Plateans fought bravely alongside one another. They fought as equals that day. They faced a far stronger force. Mike's right. Who knows how much stronger, but it was definitely stronger. And the battle was won by the Greeks. That's part one. Part two. Later on.
So far, so good, Alex.
So far, so good. As you might have expected, given my what I said at the start, the Plateans were attacked by the Thebans, and they were besieged by the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War. And they fought for 2 years. And they sent a force to break through the besiegers to try and get help from Athens, which diminished their small numbers yet further. And those who joined that enterprise, they were thought to have volunteered for a suicide mission, but they actually made it through Theban lines to their allies, only to find the Athenians declined to come to the aid of the Plateans because they feared a broader conflict that might result between them and the Thebans and the Spartans. And so after a long, hard winter, starved of supplies, unrelieved by Athens, the Plateans surrendered on the basis that they would be treated fairly. And instead, the Spartans conducted a trial. Each man was asked in turn, had he helped the Spartans and their allies in the war? Of course, the point of Platea's position was that they were allied, as Sparta knew better than anyone, to the Athenians. Thus, every man, every Platean answered no. They were asked one by one, and one by one they were executed. And I try to imagine the stoicism and the bravery to be the 200th man in that queue, waiting for your turn to deliver your honest and honorable answer before the sword. And apart from those few who escaped the siege and the forlorn breakout to Athens, living on as the stateless sons of a vanished city, Platea's men were dead. Their women and children were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground so that no two bricks stood atop one another. And the land was given to the Thebans. And the point I make in the book is this. What's the lesson to be drawn from the sad fate of the Plateans? I say it's this. All friends are great when they need you. Only some friends are great when you need them. Such was the end of Platea in the 93rd year of her alliance with Athens, as Thucydides said. And that's my story.
Well, first, Alex, I want you to know that I consider you the kind of friend to whose aid I would come when you need it, not just as a fair weather friend on my side. Myke, I don't know. We're out of touch a little bit.
Yeah,
probably.
It's a bit much to ask, Bryan. And also I'm all the way down here in New Orleans. It's a long flight.
If you're in jail and you have one phone call, I can be your lawyer. That's as far as I'm going.
I'll take it.
But second, I can't help but note that, at least based on the history on which you based your story, Alex, the Athenians, in part, refused to come to the aid of the Plateans. Did I mean I meant the Spartans, didn't I?
No. You had it right. You had it right.
Second, I can't help but note that, at least based on the history on which you based your story, the Athenians, when the time came, refused to come to the aid of Platea because they feared a broader conflict might result. And I can't help but note, and by now our listeners know exactly what I'm going to say, that NATO today find ourselves in much the same position with regard to Ukraine.
But of course, we're not in a formal alliance like NATO with Ukraine in a way that I'm not doing down your point. I think what Putin's done is disgusting and he's a war criminal. I'm just pointing out that, Platea had a formal alliance that Athens would defend it, and Ukraine isn't in NATO. But hey, one of the reasons I was looking forward to this episode so much was that I, in my book, told stories that I like. And I get the opportunity from time to time, like today, to turn to someone like Myke, who's a real expert, and say, how did I do? And what did I miss?
Myke,
right.
Over to you, Myke.
So yeah, I'm delighted to be able to weigh in. So your listeners have probably already figured out I don't get invited to parties much, and one of the reasons is that I'm kind of the killjoy, right? Look, these stories from our ancient past are extremely inspiring, and that inspiration has value. And I would never poo-poo someone taking a lesson from history that's galvanizing or inspiring in their regular life, even if it isn't strictly true. Myths and legends have a role, right? And just crapping on them is not useful, right?
Hey, Myke, let me just add something right there to that point, which I think is really important. So our listeners know I'm PK, preacher's kid, and I won't tell the whole story, but in college, I just happened to be roommated, that's a word, with very combative, very committed people of different religious faiths. And they were constantly arguing about whether every jot and tittle of the Bible is true. And my answer was, I don't care. If there's something we can get out of the stories to help us live our lives better, maybe they're true, maybe they're not, but they're good stories and they help us.
Yes, this is the point. If any of you have read or seen the film The Life of Pi, that's the whole point of that movie or book. Right. Mm-hmm. You go through this whole movie. I'm going to ruin it for everybody. Another reason I don't get invited to parties. But
Myke, it's like 10 years ago. So if you haven't seen it by now.
Yeah, it's your own downfall. So you go through this whole story where he's on the boat with the tiger. And then at the end of it, you figure out that no, there was no tiger. He was just imagining that to save himself from the pain of what actually happened in that shipwreck. And in the end of the book, they're like, well, which story is true? And he goes, which one do you like better? Because either way, I was shipwrecked and I suffered. Well, the one with the tiger is better, even if it isn't true. My point is that even if a legend, even if something you read in Plutarch or something you read in Herodotus or something you read in Thucydides is not strictly accurate, if it inspires you, if it galvanizes you, it has value. And what I do as an historian who wrecks myths, it's sort of like how I make my living. At no point do I do that in a malicious way, right? I'm not interested in making people feel bad. I'm just interested. Well, in the case of the Bronze Lie, I was deliberately setting out to demolish the myth of the Spartan super warrior. Spoiler: they were not particularly tough at all, because that myth was being used by the far right, the political far right around the world, as a galvanizing symbol and as an organizing principle. And I wanted to attack that. So I actually, I had a specific motivation in telling the truth there, because in that
I blame Gerard Butler, by the way.
That guy's just making a buck. Although I want to point out that 36-year-old fit Gerard Butler, who stars in 300, the real Leonidas fighting at Thermopylae, he was in his 60s. Right. So who's this guy, right? But to the lessons. Look, I think that the lesson you draw, Alex, is a great one, and I think that that it has important points about self-reliance. It has important points about understanding the pressures that consequences in politics can put on people. The NATO example is a great one, right? But even that, I think a better one is social media cancellation, right? When someone gets canceled on social media, a lot of their friends, out of necessity, can't stand with them, right? Because yeah, you could stand with your friend, but then you're going to lose your job. You know, you're going to lose your ability to function in society. You may get kicked out of the school that you're in. Like it's a real thing and a real traumatizing thing. And understanding that lesson that you put out there, Alex, is that has real applications there. But no, it is not strictly true, right? And there's a few points I wanted to point out here. So the first is you talk about a martial Sparta, and it just isn't the case. One of the enduring myths in ancient history, and particularly surrounding ancient warfare, that I wrote a whole book, The Bronze Lie, to demolish, is the idea that Sparta was any more martial than anybody else. They weren't. And the evidence is just undeniable. In fact, if you look in the center of the book, I actually keep score. Not exhaustively, but pretty comprehensively. And you find out that Sparta did slightly worse than their peers in the ancient world. We also find out that, you know, this idea of Spartans being professional warriors, they absolutely were not. Certainly not in any conception of professionalism that we think of today. It's better to think. Go ahead,
Mike. Let me interrupt you there. By the way, everybody, I really enjoyed The Bronze Lie. It's a great read.
Oh, thanks.
It's history, but it's very entertaining as well. But part of your point, though, is they weren't super warriors and they weren't strictly professional soldiers like we would think of it today, like you were. But they were more of those things than anyone else in Greece, right?
They were more disciplined and more organized. And they were more disciplined and they were more organized because what they were aristocratic dandies who didn't have to work. They had, that's the truth. That's
well,
the
like
truth.
Alex.
Much like myself again, twice in an episode.
Right. So the reality of it is that they had a slave caste, right? The Helots. And I want to be careful here. Like, you know, they were certainly not unique in their slavery. The Athenians were pretty bad themselves, but their particular, yes, that's true. Their particular implementation of their slave system enabled a very small minority at the very, very top of society, the homoioi, the peers, to not have to deal with agricultural labor, to not have to deal with artisanship, which was taken care of by second-class citizens called the perioikoi, who were not slaves, but still not, you know, fully voting members of the body politic. But we have zero evidence that they used this free time to train for war. We have evidence that they used that time to exercise and do sports, but we don't have a single piece of source material, not written and not imagery, that shows them drilling in formation. We don't. We certainly know from Thucydides.
That's fascinating. So
And from
all we
Xenophon.
hear about about the formations and the phalanx, and so this is wasn't the case.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing about history is you have to be careful. You have to say, I don't know, right? The lack of data is not evidence either way. So we have Xenophon and Thucydides telling us, hey, these Spartans are very disciplined and organized on the battlefield. Okay. But what we don't have is evidence of how they got that way. So what we have to do is speculate to get there. We do have that wonderful quote from Aristotle, which I include in the book, which is that the Spartans are not better than other Greeks at warfare because they train particularly hard. The Spartans are better than other Greeks at warfare because they train at all.
Right. That was my point. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So, but the point being is that in the very really amateur nature of hoplite warfare in ancient Greece, which in the interest of time, I won't go into a lengthy description of it. But this idea of martial Sparta, I just got to throw a flag on that play, right? I would say that what you're dealing with is, it would be like having the Hiltons, you know, or the Trumps show up to fight. Like, these are people, they have so much money, they can do whatever they want. And so perhaps they are using that time to drill, but we don't have specific evidence that they are.
But Mike, well, hold on, Mike.
Yeah.
Just eyeballing the really pretty comprehensive to me chart in the middle of your book.
Mm-hmm.
In roughly 500 years, there's I couldn't count it, but there's 2 single-spaced pages of battles. So they must have gotten better. They fought all the time, right?
Yeah, but I mean, look, you know, you're talking across 5 centuries. They fought all the time, but so did everybody. I mean, that's not unusual. You have to remember that we live now in the modern world in one of the most extensive periods of peace in human history. In fact, this war that we're now experiencing in Ukraine is this massive bucket of cold water in our face. But prior to the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century, like, that was what was for dinner every night.
Well, and let us all say a prayer or whatever we believe in, that we didn't just happen to grow up in the bubble, and we're in now we're getting back to real history. I worry about that a lot, that you and Alex and I just happen to live at a time that was anomalous and our kids won't.
Look, I can only pray for the same thing. I don't have an answer to that. I hope, and I think, and I hope, and so much of, ironically, how this war is really being fought on Twitter is actually gives me faith, because so much of the reality of what warfare does and what it looks like is now in everybody's face all the time. I think may change things. But yeah, I hope we're not in that bubble.
I want to get back to Alex's story and your critique of it, but I did want to just make a note to our listeners. I hope I have this right, Myke. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. That part of your evidence, maybe the most compelling part to me, that the Spartans were not captured by all those values, heroism, lack of worshiping of money, non-corruption, training, is that you have poets who are exhorting them to do that, which you suggest, and persuasively to me, suggests that they weren't doing it already.
Right, exactly right. You don't need to write a poem admonishing people to do X or Y if they're already doing it. You just accept it. Like, you don't see a lot of people writing poems out here. I mean, unless the little kids brush your teeth. Like, we all just assume you brush your teeth. So I think that's exactly right. But I think the more compelling evidence is the sources. Look, the Spartans lost all the time. In fact, when you look at that list of those 2 pages, like, they surrendered, they ran away, they lost. Like, come on. Like, it's the only way you could believe that these people were super warriors is by ignoring the source material that we have, which is in fact what many people do. And I'm not interested in that. But I will say this, I want to say this. There's so many sporting efforts and so many exercise efforts that use the Spartan motto, sports teams, to inspire people to achieve an ideal. And there is nothing wrong with that. That's wonderful. But I do think it's important, at least in this case, to point out that it's not true.
Well, let's get back to my favorite subject. What did Alex get wrong?
Okay. So Alex, well, it's not that Alex got things horribly wrong. It's just that there's a little more nuance, I would add. So
in your face, Bryan.
so with at Marathon, Alex, you talk about how the Greeks were outnumbered. Yes, they were, but they were not outmatched, not even close. In fact, and now it's certainly portrayed as this massive upset victory. And I'm sure the Greeks were terrified. And I'm sure that, look, Achaemenid and Persia, by any stretch of the imagination, was the biggest dog on the block at the time.
Yes.
But when you understand the tactical details of how the Persian army was organized and how they fought, and you understand how Greek hoplites fought, and of course I'm anglicizing that, so
sure.
If anyone's a Greek person, please forgive the mispronunciation. You realize that it was a lot more even than you think. And I'll just give you a couple of quick pointers. If you care about it, Herodotus gives a list, I call it the ship list, it's what most scholars call it, of how the Persian army was organized. But the core of the Persian army, the Medes, the Elamites, the Cushites, the Circassians, the sort of or sort of Iranian steppe, Iranian plains people that form the core, the Medes. They had a similar armament that we have some idea about, and that includes short spears with no butt spike. It includes very little armor, perhaps armor in the front row that is either made of layers of linen or leather with some kind of bronze fish scale, maybe a helmet, maybe not. Most of the Persians wearing what they call the tiara. Yes, the same tiara, that same word for the thing that women will sometimes wear to fancy occasions. But it was really a cloth hood that tied over the face, so very little armor. But if they fought with an axe, some of them, if they had Scythian or Saka background, they'd have a light axe called a sagaris, quite light, in fact. A small sword, almost a knife, called an akinakis. But mostly their main weapon was the bow. And this is a very powerful composite bow, not like what you would call a self bow, drawn back to the corner of the mouth and released with a thumb hook. And this thing is powerful. It can drive that arrow through some pretty serious stuff. And while if you read Herodotus' account of the Persian army, you'll realize it's extremely diverse. There are Arabs there are people from Ethiopia there are people, I'm using the modern term of Ethiopia, people from the Black Sea. They're all armed differently. They're clearly have different battle doctrines. But
elephants, mastodons, tigers.
Probably not those. You're thinking of the 300, which is sort of a crime against history, albeit a very beautiful.
I know. I'm helping you make your case, Myke.
No, I appreciate it, man. I appreciate it. So
that's Bryan's definition of helping there for you.
Right. But so what happens when your main weapon's the bow, right? You have these, what they call sparabara, which are shield bearers, and they bring forth these giant wicker shields, probably about the size of a front door on your house, and they make a wall out of it. And then about 9 ranks deep behind them are these lightly armored guys with these incredibly powerful bows, and they rain arrows. And you know that quote from Herodotus, so many arrows that they will blot out the sun. Well, that's good. We'll fight in the shade, right? It's a great quote. Well, so these arrows, and we know how these arrows were made, because if you go to the Acropolis Museum in Athens, which I encourage all of you to do, you will see the excavations that Spiridon Marinatos did of the Colonus Hill in Thermopylae, and you will see these Persian arrowheads. They are very small. They are 3-sided. They are made of bronze. They are about the size of a 9mm bullet. They're not big at all. And they are attached, from what we know, not to wood, but to reed shafts, which means that they are very light. And they are designed to be fired at an arc from these incredibly powerful bows and to rain down on opponents who, in the Anatolian plain, around Babylon, Egypt, the places where the Persians were fighting, these people aren't wearing a whole lot of armor. And once you get those arrows rained on you, well, there's not much you can do about it, right? For a shield, you might have something made of wicker, you might have an animal skin thrown over your arm, and this method of warfare has worked really well. And I want to add, I am grossly oversimplifying, right? Just for the purposes of this conversation. There's obviously a lot more to it, but I'm oversimplifying here. Well, so this works, right?
Sorry, Myke. Let me just add a question about that I imagine a lot of our listeners are asking themselves. Well, first of all, the whole concept of linen armor seems a little ill-conceived to me, but put that aside. My feeble understanding of history is that one of the reasons why Henry V was so successful at Agincourt is they had long-range archery, if you want to call it artillery, and the French didn't. But this sounds like the forces had that 1,000 years before.
Yeah. So, and actually, I want to plug my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Livingston. He's an amazing historian and a mentor. If you think I'm at all a good historian, it's because of him. We are co-authors. We just got back from Greece, where we're researching a book called The Killing Ground, a biography of Thermopylae, which covers all the battles of Thermopylae, not just the one that the movie 300 was made about, all the way up to World War II. So he has a book on Agincourt, which will be coming out soon, where he talks about specifically what the English longbow did. And it didn't do what most people think it did. It actually shaped the battlefield and funneled the knights into the muddy ground where the English men-at-arms were able to dispatch them. And Myke, if you're listening and I told this wrong, I apologize. Hopefully,
but hey, retweet it nonetheless. But Myke, retweet it nonetheless.
Yes, please.
That's how I've kind of understood it, that the role of men-at-arms at Agincourt, and we're jumping around, but we always do on this podcast, is kind of, if we have a skill, that's it. That if I understood the Agincourt legend myth, it was precisely that the humble pikesman and a humble man-at-arms had a much more significant role than the narrative that we tell about the battle.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm now practicing medievalism without a license. When I say men-at-arms, I mean a knight on foot. I don't mean anybody humble. I mean, we're talking the richest people in English society. I will say that the English longbowmen, it seems, had a different role. But I want to shut up, because I feel like I'm very careful as an historian not to speak about things.
Rare it is that I'm the man of the people and someone else is the elite effete booster of the upper class. But go you, Myke. You own that brand. That's fine.
Well, let me just put the question crisply, as I used to do in depositions 25 years ago when I took them.
Sure.
Is it possible that archery did not evolve particularly significantly between 400 BC and 1400 AD?
That is absolutely not possible. Archery, like all military stuff, evolved very significantly. Well, see, the problem is you can't stray into a problem in history we call technological determinism, which is the idea that any specific technology is responsible for anything. The key to remember here.
Myke, I can stray into it very easily.
You can do as you like. But my point is evolution, not revolution. That's the argument you want to remember. So archery was always evolving, but you have to remember that the Persians to this point, what little experience they'd had fighting Greeks was fighting Ionian Greeks on the Turkish coast.
Right.
So this is their first time fighting, across Aegean Greeks on the mainland that we know of. And they certainly had intel and they certainly had recon, but that method of these light reed arrows with these small tips had worked great for them in different battle spaces. But now they are facing Greek hoplites. Mm-hmm. And Greek hoplites, look, we all have this idea. First of all, hopla, everyone thinks hoplite comes from the word hoplon, which is the word for the shield, which isn't even the word for the shield. The word for the shield is aspis. It comes from hopla, which means all of the gear, everything, the armor, the spear. It just means that you are geared up for war. And Greek hoplites in general, not always, because a lot of it was wealth determinative. The minimum requirement was the shield and the spear. I'll tell you about the shield in a sec, because that's really important to this. But, if you're richer, you might have a bronze helmet. You might have a bronze or linen. And I know, Bryan, you questioned the value of linen. Trust me, if you layer enough layers of linen and you glue them together correctly and you cover them in wax, they'll stop quite a bit.
I think there's some sort of pornographic joke here, but I'm not going to make it.
Yeah, I don't know. What
rare moments of restraint from Bryan Cunningham. Carry on, Myke. You're doing great.
So, and then you have a pair of bronze greaves, right? So you're pretty well armored, right?
Okay,
but
fair.
But the critical thing is the aspis, and this is the round shield, and that every hoplite had to have. This shield, it's like 2.5 feet across. It weighs about 22 pounds. It's not center grip, which is unusual for the time. It has what's called the Argive grip, which is to say that it straps to your arm across your elbow. You have a handle on the edge, and it's concave, so you can hang this massive thing on your skeleton. In other words, hang it off your shoulder so that your arm doesn't get tired. Because trust me, holding 22 pounds out, and I do reenactment too. I've punched with these things. I've knocked people to the ground with these things, but that's a burst of movement, right? You want to hang it on your shoulder most of the time. You're going to get tired real fast. Well, and they're made of wood planks, and they're made of wood planks often crosswise to each other with usually like leather lining on the inside that holds it all together and adds integrity, and then maybe a sheet of bronze across the front. Well, here's the thing, that's pretty hard to get through. That's pretty hard to get through with an iron arrow. It's really hard to get through with a bronze tipped small arrow being fired at a high trajectory attached to a reed shaft. So my point is that, yeah, you have a vastly outnumbered Greek force, but you have a real weapons and armor mismatch between them. And look, this is not a settled issue. There's a real paucity of source material. People debate this all the time. But when I boil this down to simplicity, right, what I see are 10,000 Greeks against maybe, let's say on some crazy notion, it's probably a lot less, 80,000 Persians, many of whom are, rowers that are still on the ships or on horse transports trying to make an end run around. But
right.
Still,
the forces were split is the other point. Yeah.
Yeah, even if it's 4-1, right? And they are raining showers of arrows down on these Greeks, and they are not making an impression. Every once in a while, one gets through a gap and gets in someone's leg or in someone's throat. Yeah, people drop here and there, but basically no. And then the Greeks cross that. The Greeks realize, okay, we're coming in. They cross that distance. You describe the charge, right? They've had to thin their lines, and they hit those Persians like a runaway truck. And let me tell you something: when you're putting your ass behind a 22-pound shield, and you have a 9-foot spear, and that's what you've been training with, and it's made of ash. And it's got a nice solid tip, and it's got a strong butt spike in case the front part snaps off. And all of that bronze on your body is adding to your weight. And in you come to a dude who's holding a wicker shield. And this dude is wearing almost no armor, right? And that impact occurs, and that line breaks. And what's behind them? Guys with bows in their hands. Yeah, that doesn't sound really forgiving to me. Now, right. So now I'm grossly oversimplifying. There's a lot more to this. A lot of this is in dispute. And again, I don't want to rob the Greeks of what really was an upset victory, but I just want to provide that context. I don't want to say it was even Steven, but it was more even than I think people give it credit for.
So this is super interesting,
really
Myke, and very well explained, and definitely will enhance our listeners' understanding of that battle. But I guess two things. One, is there anything that you're aware of that undermines Alex's main point of the story about a friend in need is a friend indeed? That's question one. Two, and I think we'll probably do a whole show on this at some point, Myke, and I hope you'll join us, just the reliability of history in general. I know you've just been to Greece. You've seen these battlefields. Is it possible, and I'm asking an absurd question because I want our listeners to get this, is it possible that the Battle of Thermopylae or the Battle of Marathon or the Battle of Platea, the battles of Platea, never actually happened at all?
I mean, I would say probably not. I think we're pretty confident they did happen. Look, nothing is certain, especially the further back you go. The most critical thing any historian can do, and it's the one thing historians almost never do, and it's the one thing I'm committed to doing, and so is Dr. Livingston, Myke Livingston, who I just mentioned, is being willing to look at the camera and go, hey, based on the data we have, we can't know. We don't know. Historians are terrified to say that. And we're terrified to say that because if all we say is, I don't know, what do you need us for? Right? Might as well go flip burgers, right?
And just to expand that point, I would say that's a lesson that at least American health officials could have learned across both the Trump and the Obama administrations. Just say the science is not clear.
Yes. Yeah. And it's something like nobody wants to be unsure. But the one mantra that Myke taught me, and I repeat it to myself every time I sit down to write or to research, is that the important thing is not to be right. The important thing is to get it right. And that means sticking to the data. Historians have to be, look, in my years as an intelligence officer, in my years as a law enforcement investigator, in my current job doing computer criminal investigations in the private sector, I have to be guided by data. I cannot form opinions out of whole cloth. And I have to caveat what is supported and what isn't. And very, very carefully. Otherwise, the wrong people could go to jail. Like it's that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think historians have to have that same standard. They have to have that same level. Sorry,
so
Bryan,
no, I was just going to ask both of you, Alex and Myke, what do you think, or what do we know from history, to the extent we can know, was the aftermath of Alex's story? Obviously, Platea as a city-state, as I understand it,
they were done.
Structurally was wiped out. But there must have been a few Plateans around. And what was the impact of this battle on the future of Greek history?
Alex, I've been talking a lot. Do you want to take a back seat?
No, well, I mentioned the few that were involved in the breakout to Athens, and their line was their race was run. They lived on as stateless sons of a vanished city. And that aside, of course, Thebes repopulated Platea, but they repopulated it with their own, and that was that.
I also think that if you look at it from a broader context, this is nothing new, unfortunately, right? Like you see these shifting alliances and these shifting focuses. You certainly see Athens and Sparta at each other's throats throughout the Peloponnesian Wars. And then you see them allying afterward against Thebes as Thebes arises as a major power. The end result of all of this, I think, what most historians will agree, is that the inability of Greece writ large, all of these different policies, these different city-states, to recognize that their common language, their common religious traditions, their common culture gave them enough commonality to function. They formed together in leagues, but never together as a state. And of course, what did that do? It kept them divided and it kept them weak until a cohesive state to the north, namely Macedon, arose and ended essentially Greek independence, and then eventually Rome, of course, coming behind. So I think, like, as sad as Platea's story is, it's not unique particularly. No. And even some cities were refounded. I mean, we have the Messenians, reduced to slavery, reduced to heritage by the Spartans. And then, of course, as Sparta's star wanes, you have the Thebans, refounding Messene, right, later on. But really the end result of all of this was to allow Philip II of Macedon and then later Alexander the Great to step in and sort of make Greece a Macedonian holding, and then for Rome to follow suit later.
So Myke, has anyone put that point better than Ben Franklin when he said, if we don't hang together, we'll all hang separately?
Join or die, that wonderful.
I think I botched that quote, but you know what I mean. I think your point is the Greeks were severely damaged historically because they were never able to completely work together.
Well, because they were always at war with their ancient enemy, the Greeks.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Right. I mean, look, I think it's an excellent point. And look, if you want a real example of it, let's move to something a little more medieval, since we've been talking about it. It's that wonderful story from King Lear, where he takes the bundle of arrows, he breaks each arrow separately, and then he puts the arrow together in a bundle, and you can't, right? It's harder to break. And I think that's a wonderful visual metaphor for what we're discussing.
Reminder to our listeners, we're going to have a live event in New York City on 6 June, 2022. And don't tell anyone, but we have located an amazing, historic Manhattan bar to record the episode. We're going to have some great guests. You should email us at hiddenhistoryhappyhour@gmail.com, and we'll give you all the details, and we hope to see you there. See you next time. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for topics, you can find us on Twitter or on our website, hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com. We look forward to joining you next time.
Much gratitude to our multi-talented production team of Jeremy Core, Kate Cruz, and Grace Keller, and to our visionary executive producer, Ivan Williams. And thanks also to our art designer, David Wardle, without whom this podcast would be, well, history.
Cheers.